let's crack on. So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I am your host for this episode, Karl. Yes, that is my real name, and today we're talking about 10 significant battles of the American Civil War. As a Brit, my knowledge of the American Civil War is limited to that one episode of The Simpsons where Apu takes a citizenship test and upon being asked about the cause of the war is cut off midway through an in-depth explanation and told to just say slavery. The simplification that leaves out a lot of important context, like how America went from a proud Confederacy being born to the South in ruins, sans all the slavery, and forced back into the Union at gunpoint in just 4 years. Thankfully, the following script is going to help provide that context through the lens of some of the war's most important battles. Number 10. The First Battle of Bull Run proved that the nation was in for a long fight. Neither the Confederates nor the Union expected the Civil War to last all that long, but both sides severely underestimated the resolve of the other. In June 1861, Union General Irving McDowell moved his 30,000 troops near Manassas Junction near the Bull Run River. He faced some 20,000 rebels under PGT Beauregard, but Beauregard was soon backed up by the speedy arrival, by train, the first time in world history this has happened in a battle, of an additional 11,000 Confederate reinforcements under one Joe Johnson. Federal troops slowly pushed the Confederates across Warrington Turnpike and up Henry House Hill. Those rebel reinforcements brought the engagement to a stalemate. General Barnard B, who was killed later that day according to the script, so that's a fun bonus fact for everybody, remarked that Thomas J. Jackson's brigade was standing there like a stone wall. It's unclear if this was a compliment or an insult. Historians tend to disagree about this, but it was the birth of Stonewall Jackson's lionizing nickname. By late afternoon, the two sides were of roughly equal strength. Beauregard then ordered a counterattack along that whole line that routed the Federals and sent them fleeing towards Washington. The Battle of Bull Run, or the First Manassas, was over. The war itself, though, had barely begun. Moving on. Number 9. The Battle of Shiloh shocked the nation. The war in Virginia dominated headlines, as it's wont to do. Well, the campaigns to the west were every bit as significant. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, get used to hearing that name, had managed to capture 2 vital rebel outposts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, with relative ease. But Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston planned to stop him with a surprise attack near Shiloh Church, designed to destroy Grant's 40,000 men before they could be reinforced by a further 20,000 Federals on Don Carlos Buell. That's a fun word to say.
Buell.
The Confederate attack began on April 6, 1862, and immediately achieved surprise. Disorganized Union troops were hurled back in confusion, but managed to make it back to the safety of Pittsburgh, landing in roughly one piece thanks to the ferocious fight put up by their encircled comrades in the Hornet's Nest. As the sun set, General William T. Sherman told Grant, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant calmly responded, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow then." I guess you had to be there. And that's exactly what happened. Grant was reinforced by Buell later that night and managed to sweep the rebels from the field the following day. It was a major Union win, but the shocked nation had never seen such bloodshed before. Fortunately, they were about to see much, much more of it. Number 8. The Battle of Hampton Roads ended the era of wooden warships. After the first Union attempt to just march to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia had ended in failure at June's 1861 First Bull Run, or the First Manassas if you'll remember, President Lincoln handed command of the Army of the Potomac to George B. McClellan. McClellan was a fine administrator, but arrogant and overly cautious, a strange combination for someone leading an army. He didn't even begin to move his army until well into 1862, when, rather than marching due south, he decided to amphibiously land them on the peninsula east of Richmond. The resulting campaign was another embarrassing loss for the Union. Well, the most important chapter of this happened earlier on, from March 8th to March 9th. Now, it's worth noting that the Battle of Hampton Roads was a tactically inconclusive battle and produced no real strategic gain for either side. But for the world, it was a literal world-changing moment. You see, the instant 2 ironclad ships, specifically the USS Monitor and the CSS Confederate States ships Merrimack, traded shots that just bounced off each other's metal hulls, the age of wooden ships was all but over. Immediately, navies around the world raced to replace their now obsolete sloops and frigates made of wood with iron warships of their own design. Number 6. The Battle of Antietam set the stage for the Emancipation Proclamation. After defeating McClellan at the Peninsula Campaign and John Pope at the Second Battle Battle of Bull Run in summer of 1862, Robert E. Lee, the new commander of the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia, decided to invade the North. He hoped that a decisive victory on Union soil would scare the North out of the war. Unfortunately for him, though, a copy of his plans were intercepted by Union troops. McClellan raced to meet Lee at the town of Sharpsburg in Maryland near Antietam Creek. The resulting Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862 remains the single bloodiest day in all of American history, yet, as is often the case with war, it was another inconclusive fight. McClellan managed to check Lee, but never really seized upon the opportunity. Union forces nearly won back and forth fighting in a cornfield and at Burnside Bridge to the south, but Lee was able to barely parry each blow and keep the escape route open. As a result, he soon escaped. It wasn't exactly the crushing victory for the North that it should have been, but it was enough for Lincoln to change the nature of the war with the Emancipation Proclamation, which slammed the door shut on any and all foreign intervention for the South. Number 5. The Battle of Chancellorsville was Robert E. Lee's greatest and last major triumph of the war. After blunting Lee's offensive at Antietam, the Union pursued him to Rappahannock River and took up positions near Fredericksburg. McClellan was fired for his indecisiveness, but his replacement, Ambrose Burnside, didn't really get the job done either. His forces were mutilated at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. His replacement, Joseph Hooker, came up with a plan all of his own. Union cavalry would raid Confederate supply lines north of Richmond, while the main body of his infantry would swing around to Lee's left. Outflanked and without those supplies, the Confederates would have no choice but to either retreat back towards Richmond or fight a vastly larger force at Chancellorsville that they had no real hope of ever defeating. And yet, Lee managed to win anyway by simply denying conventional military wisdom at the time and splitting his much smaller force. Stonewall Jackson led one half in a surprise attack on the Federal 11th Corps, routing it and throwing Hooker's forces into complete disarray. After several days of fighting, the Union withdrew back over a river, and it was Lee's masterstroke. But it was also his last real major victory, and Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded later that day by friendly fire. Number 5. The Battle of Gettysburg was the war's most bloody and most legendary. So after 2 more triumphs at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee decided once again to invade north. But once again, the decisive clash came before he was ready. When elements of his forces met George Gordon Meade's Union army at Gettysburg, a small crossroads town in south-central Pennsylvania, the rebels won the first day, on July 1st, 1863, outflanking and routing the Federals. But they failed to capture some hills to the south of town, on top of which the Union was able to establish a formidable defensive position in the shape of a fishhook. On the second day, the rebel corps of Longstreet and Ewell hammered away at the Federal flanks, but Union defenders fought heroically and managed to hold their ground. The next day, Lee launched a massive infantry assault against the Union center, but Pickett's charge ended in a humiliating disaster. The next day, Lee's demoralized army retreated once again. Contrary to popular belief, the Battle of Gettysburg wasn't the largest or most important battle of the war, but it was the deadliest and has come to symbolize the conflict more than any other. Moving on, the siege of Vicksburg was the South's most devastating defeat. While the war raged in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, other campaigns were waged all along the Mississippi. It's noted that whoever controlled this vital waterway would likely win the war, so it was a primary target for Union troops. For months, however, the Confederates were able to deny the North total control by holding onto the fortress town of Vicksburg, the so-called Gibraltar of the West. Ulysses S. Grant had spent months trying and failing to capture the city, but eventually he managed to land his armies on the rebel side of the Mississippi River, south of Vicksburg. He then surprised Confederates with a drive on Jackson, burning it and destroying Vicksburg's vital supply lines. Then he advanced on the besieged Vicksburg itself, finally accepting Commander John Pemberton's surrender on July 4th, 1863. Independence Day, and the day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. Mississippi was burning, a whole Confederate army of roughly 40,000 men had been wiped out, and Grant's armies were now marching deeper into the South. This was arguably the most important battle of the entire war, though it's not the one most people remember. That honour goes to, as mentioned, Gettysburg. Moving on once again, the Overland Campaign was a precursor to the horrors of World War I. In early 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was placed in charge of all Union armies. He chose to leave his most trusted lieutenant, William Sherman, in charge of all forces to the west, while he camped with Meade's army of Potomac and saw the war against Lee in Virginia. Grant's strategy was simple yet novel. He reasoned that it was the destruction of Lee's army, not the capture of Richmond, that would bring the war to a close. He would continue advancing towards Richmond, but only to draw Lee, who had orders to protect it at all costs, out into the open where he'd be vulnerable. Grant also resolved not to retreat if he lost. He could replace his losses, Lee couldn't do the same. So even if Grant didn't win any given battle, he could erode Lee's forces while never really losing any of his own strength, only his own men. That's war. In May 1864, this overland campaign began, and it arguably saw the most savage fighting of the entire war at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. Both generals found their most formidable opponents yet in each other. But when it was over, Lee had maneuvered into an unwinnable siege of Petersburg and Richmond. Moving on, the fall of Atlanta was really the beginning of the end for the South. With Grant hammering away at Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman was tasked with capturing another vital Confederate city, Atlanta. For months, Joe Johnston, who knew his small rebel force couldn't beat Sherman in the open, refused to give battle, frustrating Sherman to no end, no doubt. Interestingly, political pressure played a huge role in the campaign on both sides. For the Union, Lincoln, vying for re-election in November, was nervous about two bloody, endless sieges, one of Petersburg and one of Atlanta, and was constantly demanding of his generals to just make a move. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was growing frustrated with Joe Johnston's lack of any real decisive action over in Atlanta. He soon replaced him with John Bell Hood, who had previously served as division commander under Lee. Hood was far more aggressive, probably too aggressive for his own good, and much to Sherman's delight, he marched out for a battle that the Union easily won. Atlanta fell soon after Lincoln was re-elected. Sherman began his devastating march to the sea, which brought Confederate agriculture and morale, along with it, crashing down, and Hood tried and failed to lure him away by invading Tennessee, where he was finally defeated at the hands of George Thomas in December. And finally, number 1, the siege of Petersburg was Lee's last stand. During the Overland Campaign, Robert E. Lee knew Grant was maneuvering into an unwinnable siege of Petersburg, which housed a vital railroad hub, keeping Richmond and his own army supplied. Its fall would mean defeat within weeks, if not days, yet he couldn't stop Grant if he tried. By June, the siege had begun. Grant slowly wrapped his army around Petersburg, forcing Lee to stretch his already dwindling forces to their breaking point. And Grant had all the time, numbers and resources realistically he could ask for, and he patiently waited Lee out as desertions took their toll. You see, news of Sherman's march to the sea and their own starvation and hopeless predicament was causing morale in Lee's army to understandably take a nosedive. Lee was already badly outnumbered. Now his army was wasting away as his own men turned themselves to the enemy for nothing more than a simple hot meal. In spring of 1865, Grant launched a series of attacks that finally broke Lee's defences, forcing him to abandon Petersburg. Richmond soon fell, and Grant's troops managed to catch up to Lee's tiny, starving army at Appomattox Courthouse, where he forced him to surrender. The war was over. So hopefully everyone out there found this video to be entertaining, informative, and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things. As a Brit, I'm only passingly familiar with the Civil War, and hopefully, there's been some stuff people have learned out there too, but no doubt there's some stuff that I missed, mispronounced, or just got incorrect. So if that's the case, you can, leave a comment below correcting on those things or make suggestions for future content. I have been your host, Karl Smallwood. You can subscribe for more content like this. We've also got some new forms of content coming out soon that I'm excited about, where I get to answer reader questions, which is fun. We did one about Bigfoot and one about ghosts. Now, there's one about psychics. I want to do one about ghosts because I'm all in on ghosts. But you know what? That's a story for another day. See you all next time, and go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers.